Hello, welcome to another informative episode on White Davy Gardening and Worm Farm. Today we're going to be doing another Q&A live, and we'll be discussing several questions. Please feel free to ask whatever questions you like regarding worm farming, and I'll do my best to answer them. And I'll be asking a few questions of my own as well. So a lot of people are interested in worm farming. It is becoming even more and more popular. And information can feel free to come and ask questions. Hi, Sian. How is your morning? Right. So the purpose of this live is so that those who would like to start a worm farm or those who already have a worm farm but not very experienced can ask questions. It is also that I can learn from those who have been worm farming for a very long time. So we'll have an interchange of information. So please feel free to ask whatever question regarding worm farming that you may have. And so we're going to start off by asking the first question that I have prepared here. And it is, what type of container should I use for my worm bin? This is a question that beginners tend to ask a lot. Hi, Han White. Now, there are quite a few types of worm bins that you can use. There really isn't any right or wrong where your bin is concerned, unless, of course, you're using something that will put your worms in danger. Like, for example, if you're using a bin that had harmful chemicals in it, then that is definitely not recommended for your worms. You need to consider your environment temperature wise to know what is appropriate. So some of the things that you can use buckets, you can use old jars, you can use plastic bins, you can use bathtub, you can use tiered worm bins. There are a lot of commercial tiered worm bins. These, however, prove to be expensive, and you can use plastic drums as well. So it is really up to you. And if you are in an environment where you have nice warm weather most of the time, say for example in the tropics, then you can just place your food scraps in piles and put your worms in there. You don't necessarily have to create a worm bin for them. So these are some of the options that you have regarding what you can use for your worm bin. Okay, so the next question is, do I have to have holes in the bottom of my worm bin? Well, that is dependent on what you're feeding your worms. What are we talking about today? Oh, it's Worm Farm Q&A, so it's just pretty much random questions regarding worm farming. So if you have questions, you feel free to ask, and I'm just asking some as well and then giving the answers for those who are new to worm farming or those who are considering getting started in worm farming. Right, so do you have to have holes in the bottom of your worm bin? Not necessarily. It is all up to you. It depends on what you are feeding your worms. So if you know that you're feeding your worms a lot of material that is high in moisture content, then it is a good idea to have holes in the bottom of your bin, in which case you would also need to have a second or a catchment tray for the extra water. So if you're feeding your worms anything that has a high water content, then you need to have a catchment tray. However, another way to sidestep this is to use a lot of shredded cardboard or shredded paper in the bottom of your bin, and that will help to absorb some of the liquid that comes off your food scraps. A system where you water your worm bin, then monitoring how much your worm bin can eliminate the need for you to have holes in the bottom of your worm bin. So my initial set of bins had holes in the bottom, but and my experimental bins have holes in the bottom, but my regular worm bins, they don't have any holes. Okay, so the next question. What size bin should I get? I get asked this question quite a few times. Now, the size bin that you get is dependent on a few things. For example, if you are a family of two and you don't produce a lot of food scraps, then you can start off with a bin that is as small as a shoebox. If you have a large family, then and you're producing a lot of food scraps, then you're going to need to start off with a larger bin. So it depends on how much produce you have for your worms to consume. And the best way to figure this out is not just based on the amount of people in your family, because sometimes you might have two people who eat a lot of fruits and vegetables, so they will have a lot of wastage. And there are people who might have a family of five and they eat very little fruits and vegetables, so they might not have a lot of food scraps. So it all depends on your circumstance. But if you, the best way to figure out the size bin that you're to get is to consider how much the worms eat on a daily basis and how much food scraps you are producing on a daily basis. So if you are producing, say, a pound of food scraps per day, your worms are going to eat up to half their body weight in a day. So you know that then you're going to have 7 pounds of food scraps in a week. So you need to make sure that you have a bin large enough to hold that amount of food scraps in addition to worms, and your bin is going to need extra space because you're going to be continually be adding food scraps to your bin, and now you're going to end up with food scraps, castings, and worms. So these factors you're going to use to determine the size bin that you're going to get. Another factor that determines the size bin that you get: what if you are, say, in an environment where you have freezing temperatures outside sometimes? Then you might have to keep your worms indoors. Do you have space in the garage where you can keep them if your garage is warm? Do you have space in your basement where you can keep them, or under your kitchen sink? So depending on the amount of space you have, that is also going to determine the size bin that you use. And we're going to be discussing this a little bit further. I'm just taking a moment to say hi to everyone that are on the channel on this live, because there are some of you that I cannot see who you are, but welcome to the live. And I'm grateful that you were able to join me. Okay, so let's move on to the fourth question. What got you into worm farming if you are a worm farmer? So for me, prior to 3 years ago, I had no idea that worm farming was a thing. But after doing research on composting, I run into vermicomposting information, and so I just decided I would like to get started in it. I can see that I have a few more who have joined my live, so welcome to the show. As usual, Fridays we're doing a worm farm Q&A, so if you have any questions, please feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer them. Okay, so the question that I ask is, what got you into worm farming if you are a worm farmer? Yes, so as I was saying, prior to 3 years ago, I knew nothing about worm farming, didn't even know that it was a thing. So after doing research on how to compost faster and better, I ran across the information about worm farming. And so I started doing research and figured, oh yes, this is something I would like to get involved with. So that's how I get my start. So while you're there contemplating your answer and writing your comment, I will move on to the next question. What type of worm should I use for vermicomposting? This is also another question that a lot of people are interested in. The most popular composting worm actually is the red wiggler, but there are a few things to consider if you're going to be worm farming. Let's see. And White says, I started because of you. Okay. I'm glad I was able to motivate you to start. Do you enjoy it? Doing your worm farming? Right. So, what type of worm should you use? There are several things that is going to determine the type of worm. If you're looking for worms that are going to reproduce fast, then red wigglers is the way to go. If you're looking for worms that can survive a bit of a cold and a bit of heat at the same time, fluctuating temperatures, then red wigglers is your best option. If you live in a more tropical or warmer environment, then you might want to consider the blue worm or the African night crawlers because these do better in warmer environment. Of course, it can become too hot for them, but these two worms, the blue worm and the African night crawlers, do better in warmer environments. If you are in a cooler environment, then you might want to go with the Canadian night crawlers or the European night crawlers because these worms tend to do better in the cooler temperatures. Now, what type of worm bin do you use? I use several. Hi, Princess Leanne. Thank you. Right. So, what type of worm bin do you use, or do you just keep your worms outdoor, put down the food scraps in a pile, and let them feast on it? For me, I use a few different types of worm bins. I have those concrete mixing trays. That is my major form of worm bins. And then I have totes that I use, large totes. I use storage container. Okay. Yeah, so I use the concrete mixing trays and I use totes. I use buckets and I use pallets to make a 4x4 bin outside. So I use various options, and for me, my favorite is the 4x4 pallets outdoors. And the reason I like the 4x4 pallets are composting outdoors is because of the amount of space that it provides. Because I use the large pallets like 4x4, so that is the size of my outdoor bin. It is 4x4 feet, and I like it because of the amount of space that it provides for the worm. I can just keep on adding food scraps to it because as the food scraps are composting, the worms are feeding on it at the same time. So I don't have to be putting food aside saying, okay, my bin is almost full. So I have to be putting food aside or in my fridge in order to allow the worms to finish eating before feeding them again. With this bin, I just put everything I have in the bin and the worms feast on it. Okay, yours, Hanwai says her worm bin has wheels. Okay, that's nice. You can pull it around if you have to move it. You don't have to lift it. Right, so the 4x4 pallet bin, one of the reasons, like I said, is because of the space that it has. It's because I can just keep adding food scraps to it without having to worry. I don't have to worry about rodents. I don't have to worry about where I'm going to store the food scraps for my worm. And because it is so big, the worms tend to multiply a whole lot faster and they tend to feast a whole lot faster. The next thing I like about it is very little maintenance. The, the only thing I have to do, I go out once in a while, I take a hose and I just water down the bin. A month can pass without me having to add any more water to it because the size of the bin, it's going to retain the moisture. So for these reasons, I like the pallet type outdoors worm bin. That's my favorite. I don't like the fact, excuse me, that I have to lift worm bins. Yeah, so anything that reduces too much work, then that's what I prefer. Let's see. Okay. Okay, so moving on to the next question. How do I maintain my worms in winter? Do you have worms? And if you have composting worms, how do you keep them warm in winter? Do you have to do anything extra or do you just let them stay where they are? So I'm just gonna give you some information on the various type of worms, and so that will help you to decide how you need to go about taking care of your worms for winter. Red wigglers prefer temperatures between 50 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 10 to 25 degrees Celsius. So if it is winter, if your winter falls within this category, then it is fine. If not, then you need to get them somewhere where they have temperatures between 10 and 25 degrees Celsius. Let's see. Hi, Russell. Say, I use a transmission radiator on the bottom of my Canadian Nightcrawler bin with cold water pumping from a refrigerator, pump and buckets of water in the fridge. Nice. Interesting method. I use several types. An example is the pallet bin. I'm assuming that is a pallet bin, and it's very big. The worms keep warm right in the middle. Okay, yeah. Unfortunately, my worms will not be keeping warm in the middle of my pallet bin because everything freezes. No matter how warm you would figure more or less if you have a 4x4 bin that is full that it should be generating enough heat, but the temperature here is too cold for worms to survive in mine, so I have to bring them indoors. For your blue worms like temperatures between, they like 80 to 90 degrees. This is ideal for them, but they can survive in temperatures as low as 45 degrees Fahrenheit up to 90, which is 7.2 to 32 degrees Celsius. So blue worms do better on the warmer side, but they can survive temperatures of 45. The European night crawlers, they do better in temperatures between 45 and 70, of course. That is 7.2 to 21 degrees Celsius. The Canadian night crawlers, of all the worms, these are the ones that seem to be able to tolerate the lowest temperature. They can tolerate 40 degrees Fahrenheit up to 80 degrees, and that is 4.4 to 26 degrees Celsius. The African night crawlers, these are the ones that can tolerate the most heat. They can tolerate from 60 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 15 to 35 degrees Celsius. So your African night crawlers and your blue worms, these are the most tolerant to heat. The Canadian night crawlers and the European night crawlers are the most tolerant to cooler weather. And the red wiggler is a bit tolerant to both the hot and the cold. So that is why most persons or most people tend to go for red wigglers, because they can tolerate a bit of a fluctuation in the temperatures more than other worms. So keeping these temperatures in mind will help you to know how to go about maintaining the worms in the winter. So you can always, if the temperature is too cold, then you may need to move them indoors or cover them with a blanket if it is not too frigid outdoors, or use hay to surround their bin. So there are several things that you can do. The thing is though, if it is hot and your bin is outdoors, there's not much you can do except ensure that your bin is under a cool shade. I don't know if you would have access to fan that you can turn on them, but if they're indoors, then you may use a fan to cool them down. Okay, let's move on to the next question. And this question is for you. What do you feed your worms? And while you're answering that question, okay, maybe I should elaborate on what I feed my worms. So, as most of you who follow me know, that I feed my worms, most of my worms are fed finished compost. Occasionally, I'll feed them food scraps. There are some bins that I have that I feed food scraps. But the main reason why I feed my worms finished compost is because I want to reduce the problem with rodents, and I can monitor. I don't have to be worried about getting bedding for the worms, because the finished compost acts as the finished compost acts as both bedding and food for the worms. And it is just so much easier because when I compost my material, I can always take the finished compost and put it in my garage without having to be worrying about insects and rodents getting in. Whereas if I have food scraps, I would have to let it stay outside and freeze. No problem there. But the problem is when the snow falls and it starts to thaw and freeze again, I can't move the container that has the food scraps in there. Sometimes the snow falls so heavily that I can't even see or reach to where the food scrap is. So having finished compost, I can just take it into the garage with where the worms are and then gradually feed it to them. The next thing I like about about finished compost, is that I don't have to worry about feeding my worms every week. I can fill the entire worm bin with finished compost and just let them feast until when they're finished it. So these are the reasons why I like using finished compost. Of course, finished compost kind of have its disadvantage, because for one, it's not as moist as the food scraps, and so the worms won't look as fat as worms that are fed food scraps. Let's see what Russell says here. Taking a break right now to learn from White Davy. Okay. Then on to feeding the hatchlings. Okay. Then time to start cracking buckets. First the ANCs, then on to the ENC. Okay. Let's see what Lillian says. I used to wonder about you using compost, but I see that's a great idea. Okay, okay, thanks. Yeah. Um, so the food scrap tend to make your worms look a bit fatter because they contain a lot of moisture. And from my experience with worms, when they're in a reasonable amount of moisture, not too much that it is harmful, they tend to look fatter. When I had my hydroponic system and I had worms in there, those are the fattest food scraps, breaking it down, which is what the worms love. So because of that, the worms tend to gravitate more to the food scraps than they do to the compost. But the disadvantage of using the compost is that sometimes it can settle, and when it settles, then it's a bit hard to deal with because the worms, if it's wet, it becomes this clump, and sometimes it might restrict the airflow, so you have to be turning the content of the bin frequently to ensure that the worms get a reasonable amount of air. Sorry. Why not put moisture in the finished compost? I do put moisture in the finished compost. I try to keep my compost damp all the time because when it dries out, then your microbes may die off. So I try to keep my compost moist. And when I'm feeding it to the worms, I have once per week I go out, or twice per week I go out and moisten the bin with the finished compost. But for some reason, it does not have the same effect as the food scraps with the moisture that it has because the compost is already broken down. So the level of microbes that you will have there might not be the same as the amount that you would have on the food scraps. I don't know what the science is behind it, but they tend to gravitate more to the food scraps than the finished compost. Okay, so next question. Where can I keep my worms? And I kind of touched on this earlier when I was discussing the size worm bin that you can start off with. Now, worms like dark places. So you're going to choose the darkest area that you can find for your worms. They don't like to be disturbed. I see it gets compacted. The compost also contains worm poo, so they don't feed well. Yeah, and they tend to be scattered all over the bin, so you don't get to see how much worms you have when you use finished compost. But they can tell the difference between their poop and the compost. So, oh, hi, Indiana. So it's not much of a problem for them where that is concerned because they can tell the difference. So they will feed on it, the compost that is. But yes, it does get compacted and it restrict the airflow. So from time to time, you may have to aerate the bin. So what I've been doing is occasionally I will add a bit of newspaper or crushed or crushed shredded cardboard because it provides some air pockets in the bin in between the finished compost. So it makes it a little less compacted. Right, so where can I keep my worms? As I was saying, the worms like dark areas. If you don't have a dark area, you can always put a blanket, a thick blanket over the bin to make it dark, or just keep your bin covered. It's not a good idea to use light or opaque worm bins unless you can put it in a dark environment because the light is going to affect your worms. So you can keep your worms in your basement. If you have tropical or fairly warm environment, you can keep them outdoors. You can keep them in your garage, your shed. You can, if you have a limited amount of space to keep your worms, you can actually keep your worms under your kitchen sink. So these are areas where you can keep your worms. You need to consider, however, not just yourself, but other members of the family, because sometimes your family members might not be okay with worms or might not be okay with them being in the house. So there are several factors to consider when you think about where you're going to keep your worms. Now, do worm bins smell? I get asked that question a lot. When I first had my worm bin outdoors, no, I had no problem with it in terms of odor. When I brought my worms indoors, I had a problem with it where odor was concerned. The bin was smelly, but then I've only been vermicomposting at that time for 2.5 months, and my bin was smelly. But as I gain more experience, I get to realize that your bin will be smelly if you have too much food scraps in there. The bin is not aerated properly. Hi, New Jersey. Yeah, I see. I'm glad you were able to join us. Right, so if you have too much food scrap in there, your bin is going to be smelly. It's going to be acidic, which is why it is smelly, because there's so much food in there and it starts to break down. The bin become anaerobic. So your bin can be smelly, but in general, your worm bin is not supposed to have any odor except an earthy smell. If it has any odor apart from an earthy smell, it means that something is wrong with your worm bin and you need to pay some attention as quickly as possible, because if it is smelly, your worms are going to be in danger, because you smelly usually represents acidity, high acidity in your bin. Right. Yeah, so if your bin is acidic, then you need to crush some eggshells or use some calcium carbonate or diatomaceous earth in your worm bin to neutralize it. Then you're going to stop feeding your worm bin for a while, so you give the worm time to consume the food that is already in the bin. After that, you're going to monitor the amount of food that your worms eat in a day and make sure that you don't give them too much, because your bin is going to become anaerobic, acidic, and smelly again. And that can pose a problem because it's going to develop mold, which is bad for your health and the health of your family members. So you have to take these into consideration when you're putting your worm bins indoor. But once the bin is being cared for properly, then your bin should not be smelly. Okay, and my final question. Of course, if you have any question, please feel free to ask and I'll do my best to answer. But my final question for you today is, what can I use for bedding? This question is one of the most popular worm farming question that I've ever been asked. So, what can you use for bedding for your worms? You can use peat moss. And before I go on to this, telling you the other stuff that can be used, I'm going to be elaborating on peat moss some more. Peat moss is the same as sphagnum moss, but the difference is sphagnum moss, even if it is dried, unless it has gone through a heat process, whether baking or boiling or whatever process, if it has not gone through a heat process, even if it's dry, it is alive. If you add moisture to it, it will grow. So when you're buying peat moss, you have to be careful if you're getting dried sphagnum moss or you're getting peat moss. Once the sphagnum moss has gone through the heat process, it becomes peat moss. But sometimes this term is used interchangeably, and so you may make the mistake of buying the dried ones that has not gone through the heat process. You put it in your worm bin and it starts to grow. Under normal circumstance, growing is not bad, but sphagnum moss is very acidic. It is so acidic, it loves acid to the extent where wherever you plant it, it will convert the soil into an acidic soil and kills everything else that does not like acid that is around it. So therefore, if you're going to buy peat moss, you need to make sure that it is one that has gone through the heat process. So sphagnum moss is either the dry or the green one that will grow. The peat moss is when it has gone through the heat process. So check the details before you buy it if you're going to be using peat moss in your worm bin, because the worms don't like acid. I just learned something. Never knew that. Thanks. Oh, you're most welcome. Right. Coconut coir is the next thing that you can use as bedding for your worms. It is not acidic, and the worms tend to love it. Composted animal dung is also very good for bedding in your compost, in your vermicomposting bin. And notice I said composted animal dung, because if you use fresh animal dung in your worm bin, it is rich in nitrogen, which is going to make your worm bin hot and it can kill your worm. So either you're going to use composted animal dung, animal manure, or you're going to let the manure age before using it in your worm bin. You can use shredded paper, you can use shredded cardboard, you can use dried leaves. All of these work very well in your worm bin. Um, there may be other stuff that you can use. I'm not familiar with any other form of bedding, but if you're familiar with something else that can be used as bedding, please do feel free to share. I'd be happy to learn. Right, so these are the type of beddings that you can use in your worm bin. Okay, so I have exhausted all the questions that I had prepared for this live. If you have any question, please feel free to go. Oh, which one do you like best? Well, for me, if I'm going to be adding bedding to my worm bin, I use what is available. So it's not, for me, it's not a matter of which one I like best. I use what is available and I go for anything that I don't have to spend money on. I'm frugal that way, yes. So for me, shredded paper and cardboard and dried leaves, that is what I use for bedding because they're readily available. And if it's readily available at no cost, then I don't see a need for me to go out and buy something else to use. The cardboard, what I like about the cardboard is the grooves that are in the cardboard. Okay, thanks. You're welcome, my dear. The grooves that are in the cardboard, the worms, I don't know what it is about it, if maybe because it is dark or because the space is secure. So they like to go in between the grooves in the cardboard and lay their eggs, or maybe they feel that the eggs are safer there, but for whatever reason, they just love to be in the cardboard. I prefer the living peat. Just add the lime and everything will be fine. It breaks down much easier for the worms to eat. Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess that would work too, eh? The balancing of the pH by adding the lime. Yeah. I use shredded paper. Okay. Yes. Yeah, so I don't know. They tend to love the cardboard. I've never used the peat moss, and I've never used, well, I use coconut coir sometimes. I haven't been able to get any because I don't buy it, but sometimes our local Jamaican local restaurant here supply me with some, but outside of that, I don't really have access to much of it. So yes, they actually eat the peat moss. Whatever you use for bedding, the worms will eat. And that is what I like about the bedding, because it is a nice environment for them to lay their eggs, and at the same time, it is providing food for them, which is one of the reasons why I like to use finished compost as both my bedding and worm food. So let's see now. Animal manure, I've never really used that as bedding because I don't have access to any. I don't know how the worms do in there, but when Canadians want to get Canadian night crawlers for fishing, they always go wherever they have cattle and cows and dig up underneath the dung to find Canadian night crawlers. So I'm assuming that they must really love it in order for them to be bundled up underneath there. Right. So do you have any more questions? Let's see. Can you do another video showing the worm eggs so that I know when I look in my bin? Okay, sure. Hi, Black Ebony. Um, I'm not sure I understand that. Have you are? I'm not sure I understand what you're saying there. Yeah, so yes, New Jersey, I will definitely do that for you. I thought about selling your worms. I do sell my worms. I sell the worms and I do sell the castings as well. Thanks. So helpful. You're most welcome, my dear. Right. So I do sell my worms at the moment. I am not selling any of my worms until maybe February of next year because I like to take some time off and give the worms a chance to repopulate before I sell anymore. So until March, until February, in my worms are in lockdown. Okay, so I guess that is it. If there are no more questions, then I'm going to thank you all for partaking in this live. You've kept it lively. Thank you for asking your questions. I'm glad I was able to answer them. And I'll be doing another live on Monday at 5 p.m. my time. And that live is going to be okay. Yes, I think what was this that I had planned? Oh, yes, we were going to continue our live discussion on caring for tomato plants, and we were going to focus on blights and the different type of blights and stuff like that, and other problems that the tomato plant faces. Let's see. New Jersey said, I just got some black cow and noticed it has worms in the bag. Oh, what type of worms? I hope they're composting worms and not other creepy worms. They will lay several eggs at this time, so better hold on. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Just be careful of what type of worms you've got in that bag there. Hopefully, it is some composting worms that you can add to your collection of worms. Yeah, so as I was saying, we're on Monday at 5 p.m. I'm going to be doing a live, a continuation of discussing our tomato plants and the problems that they face. and how to solve these problems. And on Friday, 12 noon again, we'll be having more Q&A for worm farming. So thank you all for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this live. If you do, please give me a thumbs up. And I hope you guys have a safe and wonderful weekend. Take care now. I'm going to be leaving this running for another minute so that if you want to subscribe to each other, then you can go ahead and do so. Let's see. Not sure. Okay. All right. So that is it, guys. Thank you for watching. The little farmer. Oh, never mind. Then you're gonna have to try and join me maybe on Monday at 5 noon for gardening discussion, or Friday 12 noon for a worm farm discussion. I'm sorry you missed it though. Okay. You too, my dear. Have a great day. Okay, yes, Monday at 5. Okay, I'm signing out now. Let's see, Russell. I would be happy with worms in a bag. Check to make sure they are not Alabama jumper. They secrete mercury. Oh, how do you identify those Alabama jumpers? I've never really heard of them. Interesting. I'm gonna have to look them up and make note of that. Alabama jumpers. They move like snake. Okay. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to be signing out now. I hope you have a wonderful weekend.